Hello, I'm Eric Devereaux, and welcome to another video in this series based on my textbook, Methods of Policy Analysis. As always, in this series, you'll find in the description below a link to access the textbook for free. We are reaching the end of the series. There's only one or two more videos left after this, as we're in the fourth unit of the book, and we're looking at what it takes to produce an effective policy analysis report. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen to show you the first page of the chapter upon which this video is based, Chapter 15, Writing the Report. Now, Chapter 15 predominantly focuses on creating useful and effective exhibits and on some other tips and tricks for writing an effective policy analysis report. And I will cover those in at least one more video in the series. Someday, if I write a third edition of this textbook, I may break out the material that's currently embedded in Chapter 15 into 2 or more chapters. Tonight, in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about crafting meaningful metrics. Meaningful metrics are the measures that are used to drive the exhibits that are found in policy analysis reports. But more importantly, it is the metrics that are at the heart of what we do when we conduct policy analysis. So let me now change my screen share and share with the device that I've been using in this series so that I can draw for you while I talk. So the fact of the matter is, in policy analysis, and as I've talked about earlier in this series, you find yourself, your client, your organization, in a circumstance which I've called circumstance A. And there are different reasons why you've come to view circumstance A as less than acceptable, and you want to seek a public policy, which is a use of resources, a deployment of resources, to get you to a more preferable policy B. Well, or sorry, more preferable outcome B. Well, how would you know that B is better than A? The answer is you have some type of a metric that you have looked at that says there's something about A that is not where we want the world to be. We've measured something that we do not like, and we'd like to find a way if we can find some way to improve our outcome along that measure. Okay? So metrics really are at the heart of what drives policy analysis. Metrics tell you the following: that there is a problem. Often we don't even think there's a problem unless we can measure something and say, well, that's not acceptable. Um, they may tell you how the problem has changed. And they may tell you, you know, they may show you that a policy is helping, right? These are things that metrics tell you, right? They are measures that we construct for this purpose. Often in policy analysis, we have metrics that are normed against time or measured against time. So classic one, the crime rate is going up, or the count of violent crimes is going up. Um, uh, Employment is going down. Inflation is going up. Employment is going down. Gas prices are going up. We are talking about changes over time. These are measures that we are using to drive our conclusions about that there is a problem and how the problem has evolved and what we might do that might help the problem. Um, One of the factors that affects all policy analysis that is relevant to the content in my textbook, sort of rapid turnaround public policy analysis, is that you have to rely on data that is available now, quickly accessible, to craft your metrics. You may not have the opportunity to say what would be the ideal measure at this moment, especially if measuring what you would really like to measure means you have to stop doing what you're doing, take the time to go out and collect data. You may not have the time to do that. You may not have the resources to do that. So one of the issues that arises constantly in the world of practical policy analysis is working with the data that you have, because you don't have an opportunity to get something else. And existing data can have a lot of defects. It can lead to incorrect conclusions. It cannot measure exactly what it is you wish to know. And then you have to try to craft a metric using that data, maybe in combination with other factors that will assist you in your public policy analysis. Um, there are some aspects of metrics that I emphasize in chapter 15 of the book, and it has to do with how we know that we have meaningful metrics. So we can measure lots of things, but they may not actually have much meaning in the policy process in the way that we would like, okay? So meaningful has to do with semantics. What is a metric telling us? Okay? So the metrics we construct, we would like them to be consistent. That is, if we define a metric and use it, it gives us a consistent set of measures. We would like it to be unambiguous in what it is communicating. And that can be a huge issue because you can have a metric that behaves in different ways in different circumstances, and in fact is ambiguous in what it is communicating. If you try to use that metric, you may drive policy in an incorrect direction. I'm going to give you a very, very blunt but actual real world example of how things can go terribly wrong if you don't think through your metrics. So one of the times in which we have to be very careful is we have to be careful using percentages, right? Because a percentage is based on a fraction, and a fraction has a numerator and a denominator. And if you have a metric that is based on a fraction, the problem is that it could change because the numerator changes, it could change because the denominator changes, or it could change because both are evolving over time. And often we see a lot of metrics that are based on percentages. And the unemployment rate is a percentage, for example. The inflation rate is a percentage, for example. And we have to be very, very careful about these, that we understand what's driving them and make sure we can interpret them correctly. So let me give you a very grim but realistic example. Let's say that you were looking at food insecurity in the Ukraine in the 1930s. So the time period that we're looking at is the 1930s, and this is the percent of the population without reliable food. In other words, these are people experiencing food insecurity, okay? If you looked across the 1930s, it would be very easy to craft a metric that shows that the percentage of the population without reliable food goes down across the 1930s. You may say, wow, during that period of time, the Soviet regime did really well by the Ukrainian people because it was able to get them off of some version of food insecurity. By the end of the 1930s, food insecurity was way down. But that's not the narrative. If you know the story here, it's incredibly grim. Because the problem is this percentage is based on the number with food, right? And it's also based on the number without food. So we have to look at both counts, right? So the numerator is the number without food. That's our numerator. But the denominator is the total population. Okay? But within the total population, there are two groups. There's the number with food, and there's the count of those without food, because they're in the denominator as well. What happened during the 1930s was the collectivization of agriculture by the Stalinist regime resulted in tens of millions of Ukrainians starving to death because there was a transition in how agriculture was being managed in Ukraine, and the Soviets were removing food out of the Ukraine to use in other parts of the Soviet Union, and tens of millions of people starved to death. So what's happening is that this group is getting smaller and smaller. And as this group gets smaller and smaller, naturally, you will see this number go down. And what's actually showing is starvation, resulting in the remaining people in the population. Of course, they have food, they're the only ones left. So you have to be very careful here. Again, this is a blunt and very stylized example, but this is actually a real example of how things could go wrong with a metric if you were not careful. You may be familiar with other examples where a metric is supposedly showing an improvement or a problem in society, but actually it's really based on some other type of change, okay? Something else you have to worry about when you construct your metrics is you have to worry about the counterfactuals. I talk about counterfactuals elsewhere in the book, and they are incredibly important in public policy analysis and also in program evaluation. Counterfactuals have to do with what would have happened in the world if we had not changed public policy in a particular direction. Where would we have ended up without this policy? It matters with metrics because if you're not careful, Metrics cannot reflect counterfactuals and can lead to the wrong conclusion. So here's an example. I talk about a version of this in the book. It has to do with economic activity in a beleaguered business district. Let's say that you have a business district in a community that has suffered disadvantage and disinvestment, and you're trying to promote economic development there and economic activity, get more businesses started, get more foot traffic, build up the population of restaurants, prevent community decline. These are all important goals in urban politics, okay? And you have a measure that is measuring economic activity in the business district, and then you have a place where you try a new policy right here. This is your new policy, and you continue measuring that economic activity, and it looks like that. And everybody says, well, we deployed a bunch of new resources at this point in time, and we ended up with a flat line. In other words, we come to the conclusion that we didn't do any good. The policy failed. Yes, the policy may have failed, or maybe it succeeded. Perhaps at exactly the same time, a very severe economic recession swept through the area. And without that recession, then you would have seen a decline in economic activity. But you didn't see that decline because this gap is due to the new policy actually propping up the business district in the middle of this economic recession. Now, you could define a metric that actually took into account economic conditions as a way of referencing what was the measure of activity in the community, okay? If you actually embedded something about inflation, or you embedded unemployment, or a GDP change, right? The change in GDP, you might be able to say with an appropriately crafted metric, actually, this is a huge success. This was a huge success because if we recraft our metric, we can see that relative to economic conditions, we're actually doing very, very, very well. We could see, for example, we could see that the average amount of economic activity in the community relative to inflation or unemployment or GDP change was actually very strong. While GDP actually went down nationwide, we saw an increase in economic activity in this business district relative to that, and we did very well. If we norm it appropriately, we will not come to the wrong conclusions. And these are just some examples of how you have to be very careful about how you craft your metrics, because again, you want them to give you an unambiguous answer. So what I often ask students to do is to subject a metric to a stress test. Some form of stress test is based on scenarios. What happens under different scenarios with this metric? Is it unambiguous that when it goes up, that means one thing, when it goes down, it means another? Are there scenarios where it could move in a particular direction and the meaning that has to be gleaned from that is the opposite of what we intended? Does it always behave consistently and unambiguously according to our purpose? So you take different scenarios, you run the metric over the scenarios, you see how it behaves, and if it has problems, you try to recraft it and adjust it so to avoid those problems and to find a way to get a metric that does not lead you to false conclusions. And you can have, I've seen many different metrics that are bandied about in public policy, especially in two areas that they're particularly problematic. Criminal justice and education are two areas where metrics can really cause a lot of havoc, convince people that crime is going up when it's not, convince people that education is not working when it is. I've seen this over and over again because of how things are being measured. The other problem you have to worry about with metrics is you have to worry about perverse incentives. If you establish a metric and you say that this is how we're going to measure success and failure in a particular policy domain, you have to be careful about the incentives you've created there for your community, the people in your community, organizations, and individuals. How will they react to those metrics? How will they perceive them? And will they try to manipulate them? The most famous example of this, discussed in my book at one point, is high stakes testing. High stakes testing in K through 12 education. We put in place a bunch of tests, standardized tests, had students take them. If their test scores did not improve over time, Or if their test scores went down, we could label a particular school a failing school. It could cost teachers many things. It could cost the school itself resources. It could get bad press for the school. It could cause parents to pull their children out of the school. It could also cost teachers bonuses at the end of the year, especially if there are financial implications tied to this. And what we saw in Atlanta, in Chicago, and in other major urban areas that used these high stakes tests and tied them to things like teacher bonuses was we saw teachers beginning to cheat. They found ways to manipulate test scores, manipulate the tests in order to prevent themselves from facing the consequences of these metrics. And so you have to be very careful when you deploy metrics that they don't create perverse incentives that result in negative behaviors. If you build a public policy around a metric and people can find a way to game the system, they may try to game the system, and instead of giving your more preferable outcome, for example, better educational results for students that are really substantive results, an actual improvement in crime in the community rather than something that's just an improvement on paper. If you want those things, you have to be careful about how you craft these metrics, measure them, and use them. All right, let me stop there. That's the end of this video about metrics. There's not a lot of additional content right now in the book on this front. I just wanted to encourage you again to think about, what are you measuring? Why are you measuring it? Does it behave consistently under different scenarios? Is it giving you an unambiguous message or unambiguous signal into the policy process? Are you convinced of that? Can you fix the problems? Can you find ways to recraft your metrics? And above all, please always be very careful about percentages, because percentages do involve a numerator and a denominator, and a percentage can change for a variety of reasons, not just the reason you wanted to see as the source of that change. Thank you again for watching this video, and I will see you again in the next one.